Good afternoon, everyone. I am Richard Pickering, the Deputy Director at Plimoth Plantation, the living museum of 17th century Plymouth and the Wampanoag homeland. And I am hanging out with writer Ethan Gilsdorf. Ethan, could you tell us what your project is today and why you're at Plimoth Plantation?
So I have a couple hats that I wear, but my hat I'm wearing today is a reporter for the Boston Globe, and I'm writing a story about what it's like to be a pilgrim or a role player here at Plimoth Plantation. I'm a complete newbie to this, so I don't have any particular training in the area, but Richard and the folks here at the Plimoth Plantation have graciously and kindly allowed me to hang out with them for a day in costume. So this coming Saturday, on the 21st, I'll be in costume, and we'll talk a little bit about my character later, who I'll be playing. And anyone who wants to come and see will be able to come see me attempt to be a character for one day.
Exactly.
And I'll be writing a story about it for the Boston Globe, which will be coming out in early, it's looking like the first or second week of July, and we can update people about that later.
And Ethan and I will be together throughout the day playing John Jenny and Stephen Deane, who, after the year 1627, which is what we represent in our 17th century English village, both men will become millers in early Plymouth. At some point during the day, Ethan and I will be leaving the village, going outside beyond the palisade wall that gives a border to the historic experience, taking off our pilgrim hats, and guests will be able to talk to Ethan and to me about what goes on behind the scenes and what is it like to build a pilgrim character. I've been here at the museum since 1984, started almost fresh out of college, and over the many years that I've been here, I've played about 14 different men. And as you age, your characters age right along with you. So when I started out in 1984, one of the characters that I played was Robert Bartlett. And that year, we recreated the wedding of Robert Bartlett and Mary Warren. All these years later, I've been playing Mary Warren's father, Richard, so I am now my own father-in-law.
And if that doesn't just bend your mind already.
Well, I think probably we're going to have really great nursing home experiences.
Yeah.
We're going to be lying in bed, and in our dementia, we'll think we're Miles Standish. I'm sure some of us are going to end up on the Learning Channel as channeling people.
My last words on my deathbed will be, I was once Stephen Deane. I was a miller in 1627.
And so the process, when you are looking at one story, but from the perspective of multiple people, it's like exploring a diamond, that you're continually walking around that diamond and looking at different facets of it. So I have not played John Jenny in many years. So as Ethan is building Stephen Deane, I am building a new John Jenny. There's been research in the intervening years. So on Saturday, two role players are debuting new characters together, but I'll have that almost 30 years of the broad expanse of the story that I can draw on.
And I'll be a complete newbie and neophyte, and will be struggling entirely, but it should be amusing to come and see how I handle it. And the other reason for people to come on Saturday is it's the day that you celebrate your wedding. You have an annual wedding is it always every June 21st or close to it?
We typically do a midsummer wedding and a fall wedding. In 1627, there are 155 or 156 documented people living in town. It's the last year that people will be residing in the walled community. In 1628, they start spreading up and down the countryside. So for a museum to have a walled exhibit is absolutely perfect. To have a complete census is a gift. And you know that young people begin to marry this year because, with the suspicion that land will be divided in 1628, if you are married, your land falls with your husband.
Okay.
And a father doesn't have to renegotiate land moves on a daughter and son-in-law's sake if they're already married. So we believe that Jane Cook and Experience Mitchell are married this year. We believe that Robert Bartlett and Mary Warren are married this year, but we don't have specific dates.
So if you come on Saturday, neither of us will be in the wedding, but we will be a part of the wedding party. We'll be villagers who are attending and watching the revelry, and it's a particularly interesting day to be there, I gather, because there's some great food and drink and dancing and sort of celebratory atmosphere on the plantation.
We took Ethan down this morning to morning meeting. At 9 o'clock each day, the colonial interpreters gather with their supervisors, with our wardrobe and textile manager, and they get the news of the day, facts that need to be remembered, maybe the number of guests we're likely to see through group tours. So this morning, Ethan was introduced to the role-playing staff and told that he would be back as Stephen Deane on Saturday. And I don't think Ethan thought there would be dancing going on at morning meeting, but explain what you saw going on.
Well, there was, because this wedding is coming up on Saturday, I don't know, maybe every day this week the staff will be practicing, but the staff needs to know how to do a period appropriate dance for this wedding, so there was a little bit of dancing happening. I took some pictures of it, and a little short video, and maybe I'll post that later on my website. One thing that we should probably mention is if people are watching who want to send in a question to us right now, and we can try to answer, you can either tweet it to @Plimoth, which is spelled Plimoth, which is the old-fashioned way of spelling Plymouth, or if you go to Plimoth Plantation's Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Plimoth Plantation 1620, you can ask a question, and we have someone backstage here, Jessica, who is going to be fielding questions and I guess passing them on to us if people have questions about things. I was going to say one thing about the morning meeting was interesting. It reminded me of the television show Hill Street Blues, where before the police go off into the their day, and the sort of staff sergeant, whoever it is, sort of says, "This is what you got to look out for. There's this situation happening here." And then that guy said, "Be careful out there."
Yeah.
It was sort of very similar. It was like we have the bees are back, but they're not the right bees. They're not actually they're not really honeybees, because honeybees wouldn't have existed in 1627, and so-and-so isn't in town this day, and we're working on something else. So please go out and weed in the garden because the weeds are starting to get out of control. So it was a really interesting peek behind the scenes, and the story I'll be writing for the Globe will be, I think, getting a lot more into the, with your permission, of course, not revealing too much of the magic that goes behind the scenes, but really talking about what it's like, to show up before the guests arrive.
And then we gruffly say, "Be accurate out there."
Yeah, right. Be accurate out there. I like that.
Because one of the things that the staff was reminded about this morning is that Isaac Allerton is not in town, that he left a few days ago. Isaac Allerton was a member of the church. He was one of the assistant governors in early Plymouth and was frequently entrusted with the business dealings of the colony. And so after 1626, he is frequently in England speaking on behalf of the colonists in Plymouth, handling their business arrangements with the merchant adventurers who supported them. But in a little town, everybody would have known that he was gone. They would have remembered the ship that took him away. We're a 7-day-a-week operation. So the historical role players are covering 7 days a week, 9 to 5, doesn't mean you're here 7 days a week, and you need to be reminded of advances in the story. So before they broke up for the day, Kate O'Neill, the supervisor, said, "Remember, everybody, Isaac Allerton is gone."
To make sure that the story makes sense. There's no sort of problems with plot or whatever.
Exactly.
And all these are not stories that your guys are making up. This is clearly all stuff that you've researched, that's based on the documentation, what happened at a certain time, that there would have been a wedding on this day, that this gentleman would have been out of the village during this period of time.
And we recreate the year 1627. It's a very well documented year in the chronicles of the governor, William Bradford. We also have letters from visitors to Plymouth that were written in late 1627, early 1628, that provide a physical description of what the community looked like: the number of men, the number of houses, the fortifications, the number of guns. These were Dutch ambassadors or emissaries from Manhattan who ostensibly were coming for purely diplomatic reasons, but you could also tell that they were coming on some economic and military reconnaissance. They wanted to see how strong this English competition was. Oh, we have a question. what are the tricks you have to keeping in character when a guest tries to stump you?
Mm.
I actually had to keep myself from revealing myself to a guest one day. I went out to lunch because, as with any job, you have a lunch hour. Walk out of the village in my pilgrim clothes. And I think I went to the drive-through at either a McDonald's or a Burger King and was wearing sunglasses that I forgot to take off when I returned to the village. So I've got my pilgrim hat on, my pilgrim clothes, and I am wearing Ray-Bans. And I am talking to our guests, and I suddenly realize I'm wearing sunglasses. And I had to keep my hand from coming up to grab them. And I thought, as long as I don't acknowledge that I'm wearing sunglasses, the guest won't either. And sure enough, no one said, Pilgrim, you wearing sunglasses? Right. And as soon as I could, I got myself behind a house and pulled them off and put them into my pocket. Guests will sometimes point out planes going overhead, or they'll ask you about something that they're wearing or what their camera is. So, for example, you can get completely derailed by someone saying, "Can I take your picture?" Just instead of losing all of that ground with what's a camera, what's a picture, what do I have to do, just say whatever you wish. Keep your movements small so that you're not ruining their photograph. And just, it's harder now in a digital age, but you used to be able to listen for a camera click, and then you knew your movements could get bigger again. But the whole job of the role player or interpreter is to keep the conversation going back to the historical reality of the 17th century and not get distracted by stuff that's essentially wasteful. That there were times when a guest would say, "Can I take your picture?" And if a role player was interested in low comedy, they might say "picture" and grab a picture. That does not happen anymore. That has not happened in probably 15 years here. The commitment is to remaining in character, keeping the conversation and the experience focused on the 17th century, and always approaching that past in a dignified way.
Do you find that with probably 99% of the guests are obviously respectful and they want to get a genuine historical experience out of it,
yes.
And there's probably just the 1% or the 0.001% that really do try to punk you or try to do things to throw you off. But it strikes me that I found myself, for example, when I was visiting here a couple weeks ago, just to get my handle on the village and my experience here, what that might be like, as I was speaking to people in costume who were playing roles, that I found myself adjusting the way I spoke to make sure that I wouldn't actually mention things that wouldn't be part of their experience, so as not to throw them off. Yeah. And I found myself in a way doing a little bit of a role play myself, sort of automatically. Do you find that to be the case with a lot of your visitors?
I come here so infrequently as an uninformed visitor. Yeah. I've been here so long that my experience of the place, it's hard to imagine it as a new person. But that's utterly fascinating that the process is actually giving you a process too, and that you're exploring where you fit in the dialogue, and that you're going through historical reasoning and what would be the right way to phrase that, how do I best interact with this person, but at the same time, that person on the other side of the conversation is going to be able to handle whatever you throw at him or throw at her. I had 2 weeks ago, we just had massive visitation. We had so many school children, and some of the schools wanted guided tours, and so many of them wanted guided tours that I actually had to come out of the office and lead a group of third graders. So I was with these kids for about 2 hours, had a blast, and at the end of it, as the kids are getting on the bus, this little boy walks over and he says, "Richard, I was going to ask a pilgrim if he knew two-headed dinosaurs when I came today, but I didn't want to embarrass you that way," because he said, after spending time with you, I realized that's not a good question to ask. Huh. And I thought that's absolutely brilliant that this child who came thinking, I'm going to cause some mischief.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
going to ask
yeah.
about two-headed dinosaurs, knowing a pilgrim wouldn't know about two-headed
Right,
dinosaurs.
right.
That at the end of it, he said, I wanted to ask a question where I learned something,
Right.
which I thought was brilliant.
The tiny little adjustment I noticed myself was when I was just speaking with people who pass in the street, on the main street of is it, I forget the name of it, High Street? What is the main street running through the center of the village?
The street.
The street. It's just called the street.
Yeah. The street and the highway.
The highway, okay.
Yeah.
That instead of saying, hey, how are you doing, or, hi, I found myself saying, good day.
Perfect.
Which probably isn't accurate at all, and we'll talk a little bit more about, what my character of Stephen Deane should be saying, and one of the questions here is about my dialect, which maybe we can do a little practice session, because I'm completely a newbie. But it was interesting in my own very simplistic way of role-playing or acting, that seemed like the closest I could come up with that would seem appropriate and not be something that would, it felt like, because I wanted, actually, as I realized as I spent time in the village, even though I was dressed in my street clothes, it was so quiet that day, and I was in the backyard of one of the houses looking at the small, kitchen garden that they had there, and looking over at the sheep and the chickens walking around. It's very easy to transport yourself imaginatively, I think, into that era, even if you know nothing of that time. You can faintly hear the cars going by on Route 3, between where the plantation is. I guess there's a major road, and then there's the ocean, and then there's Route 3 sort of behind us or something. So you can hear that, and I guess occasionally an airplane will fly overhead. But aside from that, it's completely, my experience so far anyway. I'm looking forward to spending a whole day here on Saturday to really immerse myself in it. Well,
let's show. I know we have some schools watching.
Yes.
And kids are probably not going to know what's coming out of my bag right now. Does anyone remember the Walkman?
Oh, yeah. This is great. This is a historical artifact from
yes.
From which era?
The pre-digital era, when you had to listen to things on audio cassette, and not all of our dialect recordings have yet been transferred to CDs. So Ethan's going to have to work from an audio cassette. I wasn't sure whether he still had access to a cassette player, so I brought this from home. And I told Ethan a story earlier that in 1995, the National Society of Mayflower Descendants asked me to go to England and Holland with them and play 4 different Mayflower men over the course of their 2.5 weeks abroad. So I had to take cassette tapes for each dialect I needed to recreate. And as they were driving through the English countryside, or even driving through the Dutch countryside, I would be sitting at the back of the bus learning the dialect for the next man that I had to be. I find that when you change the way you sound, it helps to remind you that you need to change your way to think. I didn't want those 4 men I was portraying to come off as the same guy, just sounding different. The accent reminded me I needed to think about religious differences, educational differences, regional differences, and work practices that were different between the 4 men to set them apart. And how are you at imitating people?
I'm okay. We'll find out. I'm okay. I can fake things. I mean, I think the I'm not nearly as good as I think I am. But my girlfriend makes a joke that I tried to do an Irish accent and I end up sounding more Jamaican than Irish or something like that. So we'll see how I go. But one of the things you mentioned to me earlier that I thought was fascinating is maybe a lot of the participants in this hangout may not realize is that it's not simply that everyone on Plimoth Plantation is essentially speaking as an Elizabethan English person would have in the 17th century, but in fact that there are many, many dialects that are being represented, something like 15 different dialects.
Yes.
Is that what you told me?
Yes.
So that each character you might encounter during your day visiting here at Plymouth, you might, if you're sort of paying attention and really focusing in the way they're speaking, you will notice different patterns of what we might, to an untrained ear, might assume is just like general Elizabethan, Shakespearean sounding English. And these people were British; they were not American yet. I mean, they really were fresh off the boat, as it were.
And one of the things for everyone to think about is that in the 16th and 17th centuries, English people tended not to travel more than 10 miles away from their birthplace through the entirety of their lives. There is no mass media. You do not hear the way other people speak, except if you're in an urban setting or possibly a maritime setting. So now take this little community with people coming from many different regions, and they're having to learn what you mean with your pronunciation and with your regional vocabulary, so that you and I could be standing in a cornfield, and I'm talking about my bairn, and you're looking at me like, what the heck are you talking about? Because for you, it's a scarecrow. That there are very different words for exactly the same thing. So that may be one of the things that's going on here affecting community construction. And the next question is, what did the second generation sound like? That if you get your accent predominantly from your mother, since children are spending the first 6 or 7 years predominantly with mothers in the 17th century, couples that come from different regions and that marry here in New England, what do their children and then what do their grandchildren sound like? And that points up the moments that are beyond recovery. What are the holes that we might have to live with because we can't answer the questions? The record is just not there.
So you use your best guess to, when you don't know the answer to something, you just have to do some creative invention that is based as much as you can on facts. And
you try to stay away from that material altogether because you want to give the guest an experience that's grounded in documentary evidence. So you may need to have an answer if you're pushed to the wall, but you don't bring up those subjects where it's highly questionable in the content of it. And what you'll find is that by using dialect over time, you become more adept at it, but you do need to be like Eliza Doolittle, sitting there listening to it again and again and imitating the sound until it's appropriate. You're getting trained one-on-one in the springtime when we have our spring conference and the bulk of the staff is returning for the next season. They will be divided by their region, and they will work with a coach who makes sure that everyone from that region sounds identical.
Well, one of the questions that came in here is, Ethan, have you gotten into dialect yet, and how are you doing? Can you say something 17th century for us? So I have really done none of this. Maybe we should say a little bit about who my character is. His name is Stephen Deane. He's approximately 20 years old, but probably older. I myself am not 20 years old. I'm quite a bit older, you can tell. But I'll be trying to be as young as I can. I'm actually going to shave this thing off. It turns out that Denise over in the costume area said that I don't need to have the beard on. Maybe I do. Anyway, we'll have a discussion about that. And I came over on the Fortune, so that was about a year after the Mayflower. It turns out I don't last that long, but of course I won't be talking about that while I'm a character. But I don't actually live much later than 1633 or 1634.
You don't need to tell anybody how you die.
Exactly. A strange millstone accident or something like that. And I become married in 1630. I have 3 children. But my main occupation is running this grist mill, which apparently is the one grist mill that the whole town is using to grind their corn. And it's mostly corn that they're growing. Is that correct? It needs to be ground. And then I get to take a toll of 1 pottle, which
so good.
per person who brings their corn. A pottle is how much?
It's a measure.
It's a measure. Is it a quart? Is it a gallon? Is it a?
We'll find out this afternoon when we go to the mill.
All right. So, but I will not be stationed at the grist mill when I work here, and I'll just be wandering around doing different things during the day. But I need to talk about what it's like to be a miller, and I know nothing about it other than my mother's maiden name is Miller, which is amazing. So that's one very cool historical happy accident we have here, is that maybe somewhere in my past there was a Miller, but I knew nothing about it.
For those of you that haven't visited Plimoth Plantation in the last year, we now operate the Plymouth Grist Mill at Town Brook. So this afternoon, Ethan and I will be going to the Plymouth Grist Mill for some training with the millers there, so that should anyone ask Ethan or me, John Jenny is also a miller, after Stephen Deane dies, I get the rights to his works. I need to be able to answer questions about milling, mills, varied technologies. So we'll be getting trained so that we can cover that information should anyone ask us about milling.
And the mill would have been
Saturday.
located pretty much adjacent to the village, but for the sake of your village here, you can't have the gristmill right next door because there's not a...
It's not 1636.
Right.
And
Right.
it needs to be on Town Brook.
Right.
So
Okay.
it's down there. We'll be going there as well.
Right.
As far as dialect, Ethan can try some sounds now. There are universal sounds that cross over all of the different dialects. So, for example, the I in wife, the I in spice, has a slight O quality to it. Wife, spice.
Wife.
Spice.
Voice.
Very good.
Sounds Cockney or something.
That's one of the universal
That's
sounds.
the wife.
There are also generational differences in pronunciation. Sometimes when you visit the museum, you'll find older role players continuing to pronounce the K or the G in words we no longer use the K or the G, but they're still there in the spelling, like knee. An older person might say knee.
Knee.
Sometimes the sound gets overstressed, so it almost sounds like you're battering the guest in the head with the K. Knee, and that's not the way it is. It's just a light striking of the K, a light striking of the G as well. So probably in your youth, you're not using the K in knee. But in the materials that I gave you and in the cassettes, what Ethan will be hearing on his cassette is a coach giving the basic sounds for the City of London and the urban environs. And then there will be a series of dialogues where you can hear people use them in conversation that's often lifted from plays. Or one of the great things from our period is there is an increasing exchange of language between Europeans. So there are manners books written for foreigners attempting to learn how to speak English, and they're done in dialogue. So often those books of etiquette are used to give proper dialogue when you're sitting around a dinner table. Because that's one thing Ethan and I haven't talked about yet, is he's going to have to learn how to eat, because we might be eating as guests at a table.
I'm going to write that down. Learn to eat.
Learn to eat. The other day I was watching some modern people trying to eat 17th century food, which is eaten with the fingers, with a knife, and with a spoon. You have a napkin, large napkin, you're continually cleaning your fingers when you touch your food. We have a tendency to handle eating utensils as literate people. So the way we hold the fork, the way we hold the spoon is often informed by the fact that we can also write. In the 17th century, a spoon may have been held like this as a child does it when they're beginning to learn how to eat, with that bowl being brought to the mouth. It was interesting watching modern people who didn't want to touch their food, didn't want to break it apart on the fingers. They wanted to use a knife, and the spoon started to get used as a fork. So you could see them holding down the spoon on the meat as we would hold it with the fork before they cut it, instead of just taking it on their fingers and eating it that way. It was interesting how ingrained manners are in us, that when you need to represent the life ways of another people, you have to forget all those things that seem to be so common sense. Let's say we're dining, and the chairman of the board, the chief person at the table, is Ethan. As the person to his right, I am the person of next importance, and that goes all the way around the table, and that determines how food gets served. So servants and children read social signals the best. So a servant would lean forward, and basically, if you are removing food from the platter yourself, that piece of meat or whatever has been put closest to you, that's what you take. That's an indication of where you are in the feeding chain. And you, if well-mannered, would never say to the servant, could you just turn it a little? Because that would be flying in the face of the order.
So going back to the dialect, would you sort of advise that I mostly focus on how to say my best effort at, a kind of period language. In other words, master the way it sounds, or to focus on the specific words that I should not be saying that would not be appropriate. Because there's, Richard gave me a whole booklet here of all kinds of the 100 most commonly used words in that era, from basically from Shakespeare's England and that era. Things that you would say that you wouldn't use today, and vice versa. Or do you think I could pull off a kind of thing where I could actually have a few of these words under my belt and remind myself to use them at the appropriate moment, but really try to do both at the same time?
One of the ways I always started was to try to stay as close to William Bradford or Edward Winslow's language, because then as a historian, you are sharing the primary material as it was written or spoken in the past. So look to the models that you get right from the Pilgrim specific.
From their written text that they themselves wrote. Okay.
Because by staying as close to their words as possible, you're giving the guest access to a very specific Plymouth experience. And as you begin to develop a facility in period language, then I suggest that the role players look at other things, that they begin to read the theatrical literature, that they look at Shakespeare, they look at Ben Jonson, that they look at the sermons and see how those are constructed. But at first, where our job is to provide access people to this community story, stay with the language in which it's reported to us by the original observers. That said, if you were going to be with us a very long time, you would then proceed on to the next level of actually taking that documentation apart. William Bradford is writing from a separatist perspective. He has abandoned the Church of England. He has a perception of the religious life in England that may not necessarily be Stephen Deane's. Stephen Deane could have been a member of the Church of England. So now you have to enter into Bradford's account and look at it as a series of things reported. What are the events? But you may not be able to accept his perspective on those events. So you need to develop a mentality that essentially deconstructs your only access to that moment.
It sounds like the people who really work here, before they even begin to work here, they have to reach a certain level of mastery, and then the ones who obviously really love it and I guess sort of geek out about the specifics of all the different levels to which you can take it. I mean, it can get very, very involving and very, very complex in terms of thinking not only about what should this character sound like, but what would be the kinds of things that this character would, how would they talk, how would they speak, how would they think about an issue, like you were saying with the issue of religion, and how they would express their views, and how they would say they might choose not to be very outspoken about it for personal reasons, or they might be very interested in not really proselytizing, but a kind of being very clear about their views, in a public way.
Exactly. And what I find is that one of the things people are looking for are those common human experiences, birth to death. How do we give them an understanding of the subtle differences within the historical moment? So if you look at a basic entry into Christian adulthood, you may have baptism in infancy, you may have baptism that comes in the teenage years, you might have confirmation for entering the church in the teenage years, then marriage, and then the family begins again with the next generation. But that understanding of baptism could be radically different from a contemporary Christian's understanding of his or her baptism or the baptism of their children. And we are that voice that can say, yes, there are these common experiences across time, but in that particular moment, the nuances are very different. When I played Edward Winslow came over in the Mayflower, lost his first wife in March of 1621. He is the first Christian married in New England. He marries about 8 weeks later to Susanna White, who was left a widow the first winter with 2 children, a 5-year-old and a newborn. Edward Winslow's letter, dated December 13, 1621, is the only description of the event we now call the First Thanksgiving. Edward Winslow and his second wife, Susanna, again and again lost children. It's one of the tragedies. They are a very small family because they are continually losing children when they're young. That is very difficult material to deal with guests, but many guests come with the perception of there are no right and left shoes. They were shorter back then and they didn't love their children. Some of these things have crept into textbooks over the time because they're so unusual that they engage the imagination even though they're not accurate. And so if I felt after visiting with a guest a long time that they were strong enough to go with me to this difficult place, we then explored the loss of a child, but we looked at it from the Christian moment. Not that Edward Winslow and Susanna aren't destroyed by the loss of that child. The sense of loss and devastation is the same as it would be in the 21st century. But how is that loss and response to it being shaped by the Christian theology of the moment? And Edward Winslow was a leading member of the church. He becomes a leading member of the Puritan movement also in Massachusetts. So this is a man who lived with a strong consciousness of his position within a spiritual universe. And we go there. So, do you want to try out some? Sure. Try out some dialogue, and I also want to make sure we get a chance to. I just got fitted for my costume, and I'll give you guys some sneak peeks of what that looks like maybe in a second. You'll have to wait to see me in the full regalia, I guess, on Saturday. We'll make people wait for it. How did you feel when you wore it for the first time? I felt good. It's heavy. And I'm thinking about Saturday if it's going to be sunny and warm. It's a couple layers. It's a pretty heavy. Well, maybe we'll just show the folks. This is, I think it's called a doublet. Is that right? Yes. And then it's attached to the trousers. And then underneath it, I wear what essentially looks like a nightshirt. I mean, this is a nightshirt. What is this called? I don't know. A shirt. It's just a shirt. Just a shirt. Yep. But it's quite long. It gets tucked into the trousers. And then, to me, the most comical thing was the stockings, which are incredibly long, as you can see, and would fall down, so they give you garters, which are not garters in the modern sense, but it's just a woven, looks like wool or something that you just basically tie around your calf, right? Yep. Like you were tying a tourniquet to make sure that you don't bleed to death. But this is just to keep your garters up and your stockings up, because as Denise, whose last name I'm forgetting, Flavica, the costume director, reminded me that there's no elastics in the era, so in the 17th century. And then I have this great hat that I get to wear, and she also reminded me that the belt was never to holding up the pants, the belt was to hold your tools. So I get to have looks like a dagger of some sort and a little thing to keep my money in, or what have you. Okay, this is knife. Ethan's pocket. Yeah, my pocket, right, oh yeah. We're gonna tell you a really distasteful 17th century joke that shows the difference between us and them. In the PG rated, don't worry. In the period, there was a riddle that says, "What does a rich man keep in his pocket, and a poor man leave on the ground?" 10 seconds. Anybody? It's his phlegm. Because a rich man could afford a handkerchief that he would fold up and put in his pocket, and a poor man would put 2 fingers next to his nose and just blow right on the ground. They are very different than we are. Different riddles. Well, again, we'll be probably using some riddles on Saturday because it's a way of entertaining one another. What is higher than a house and smaller than a mouse? Sounds like something out of a Hobbit, but I'm just not able to find it here. Let me think. Higher than a house, but smaller than a mouse. I don't know. A star. A star. Which is a great riddle because again, that's great. It reveals the fact that these people are living at the moment the perception of the heavens is changing, and that there are some people who, as has been believed for a long time, the Earth is the center of the universe and the sun moves around it, and you have the Copernican discussion
Right.
and Galileo's discussion going on at the exact same time.
People are starting to shift their worldview.
Yes.
So what can you teach me to say that would be a basic thing you think that this character should say? Not even worrying so much about the specific dialect of London, although maybe I should be thinking about that.
There's a sentence that is much beloved around here by first-year interpreters because they practice it over and over again to get the sound down, and it merely means I found a big fish.
Okay.
I found a grampus on a bonk.
Grampus?
A grampus is a type of fish.
Okay.
I found a grampus.
I found a grampus on the bunk.
Well, your fish was lying in bed.
What's the last word?
Bonk.
Bonk.
B-A-N-K.
Bonk. Did I get that right?
I found a grampus on a bonk.
I found. Is it found?
I found.
I found
a grampus on a
grampus on the bank.
Yeah.
On the or on That's hard.
Let's see. Let's try. We'll pull one.
I found it.
We're going to Mort's relation here. This is the first pamphlet written in Plymouth, published in the winter of 1622. We'll find. We'll find a good expression for you. E is often I, and I is often E.
Oh, okay.
So this means we went and cut some wood. Some to fill timber. Some to fill timber.
Some?
Some to fill timber.
Some to fell timber.
Very good, and that's just some to fell timber.
Okay. All right.
But your E's and I's in some dialects, they can get changed.
Some to fill timber.
I love the Worcester dialect because V's are S's, S's are Z's, Z's are S's, F's are V's, and V's are F's.
Wow.
So George Soule, who we now spell S-O-U-L-E,
yeah.
If you ask him his name, my name is George Soule. I go Veshen all the time. And you just have to remember to flipping those sounds and keep them consistent. The Yorkshire dialect, can you roll your R's?
Not really. I don't know.
Cadets.
Cadets?
Cadets. That's really good, Ethan.
Sort of.
Yeah, it takes a while. You have to kind of pretend that you're living in Barcelona, but
yeah. I think when I roll, I'm really doing my throat. I'm going instead of the tongue is not actually rolling. I think. But cadets.
And one of the reasons we have these dialects recreated for us is there was a scholar by the name of Martin Wakelin who his life's work was what did Shakespeare's actors sound like? And what were the different accents and how were they affecting the verse? Because think how if we were to reach for Hamlet, say, and to be or not to be, and you're from London, where THs are frequently Ds.
Okay.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether there's noble in the mind to suffer the slangs and arrows of outrageous fortune, than to take arms against a sea of trouble, and so by opposing end them. Doesn't sound a thing like Brenna, doesn't sound like Olivier. But where that actor is from, who's playing any one of those roles, that's going to affect the way that the verse sounded.
So my character, Stephen Deane, we're saying he's from London. Actually, my understanding is that we don't actually know in the historical record where he's from, but for the purposes of your dossier that I've been given here, which is, by the way, behind us are all the dossiers about all the different characters.
We got to find out who your cattle division is.
The cattle division. So my understanding is that there's dossiers here on every character that does get played with all kinds of information, and we've decided that Stephen Deane will be from London. So if I were to, my goal would be to try to replicate a sort of basic London accent of that era. Given the fact that I have less than a week to kind of get this under my belt, I've got my cassette here. What would you recommend as like the actual way to practice? Do I just repeat things ad infinitum sort of.
It's just like My Fair Lady.
Yeah,
you are listening. This should be strapped to your head, and you are listening and repeating until all of it is second nature. So while you're doing that, I'm having to master the East Anglian dialect, which I haven't done in a while. So I'll be doing the same thing in my car because I drive a car older than most of you who are watching this. So I still have a cassette deck, and I'll be using that in my morning commute. But
you've done this for so long that it's probably pretty quickly you can adapt to these new dialects. And for me, all I'm relying on is Monty Python, routines that I did in back in the 1980s or something.
That will make you very popular. He's the wedding entertainment.
Yeah, right. What else could we do? Should we do a little bit more of that, or do you want to?
Well, I'd love to know, what are your concerns? What are you?
Well, I'm terrified. I mean, I'm excited, of course, and as someone who's done some role playing as a gamer, as someone who's played Dungeons and Dragons, and as a sort of amateur actor, I don't have a problem standing up and making a fool of myself. But and I don't have a problem dressing in, quote unquote silly clothing that would not be, that most people might think is strange. That doesn't bother me. What I'm concerned about is just wrecking a user's experience or embarrassing you guys,
that won't happen.
by even lapsing into something that is even miles and miles away from what it ought to be. I'm sure I can pull off some sort of very rough thing that sounds marginally accurate in terms of like a British accent. Beyond that, I'm a little worried that I'm just going to be,
Don't be
weighing
worried.
Over my head.
Don't be worried, and you'll be with me at every moment. And as with any new interpreter, you listen to the older, more experienced interpreter, and then you try that material out. So it could be you'll hear me tell a story, and when we're alone, you can say, is that also good for Steve and Deane? Can I use that? And just use it yourself. I can also give you guidance by telling your stories.
Yeah.
Steve and Deane came over on the Fortune. That was 2 years before I came, and I can compare our journeys. And if you're listening carefully, you're getting all the details on how to handle your own story.
Right.
So we are listening to each other, and when we're alone, I would say, you can use that part of the story, Ethan, but that perception is a separatist perception, so you wouldn't take that particular slant with it. But one of the things we don't know, or I don't know, because I can't remember, in May 1627, all of the cattle in Plymouth are divided among the families. Groupings of 12 or 13 got a share in a cow and 2 she-goats, with everyone having the rights to the bulls and the rams for additional breeding. So what they did was took a man, a wife, their children, and if they didn't have a grouping of 12 or 13, would add another man and wife and children, or they'd add in the many bachelors in Plymouth. There are 25 bachelors in town, and the marriageable girls, Mary Warren, Jane Cook, they're off the marriage market. This is a predominantly male experience being in the colonies. I don't know which family Steve and Deane was attached to, and that may be indicating where you were living at that time. So let me show you. This is a modern transcription of the document. All right, so you can see how it's broken down, husband, wife, children, and then a description of the particular animal. So let me just scan for Steve and Deane and where he ends up, because that could be very indicative of family relations.
So because he would have gotten the livestock, shared it with these other people,
yes,
he would have lived near them, or would have...
It's possible he might have been living with them, because one of the things that New Englanders learn from Virginians is let's all distrust bachelors. They just cause trouble. They're described as kind of rootless trees that plant themselves temporarily, are in competition with married men, and are endangering married men's ability to feed their wives and children. Virginia was populated by bachelors. There was a lot of social disorder. So Governor Bradford and the council said, anyone coming here without natural family is to be assigned a household to live with until married. It also ensured that you were getting regular meals and being fed. So wow, look at that. Hey, everybody, here for a moment. Listen to this. This lot fell an heifer of the last year, which was of the great white-backed cow that was brought over in the Anne, and 2 she-goats. For those of you that don't know what a heifer is, that's a cow that hasn't been bred, so a cow that has not yet had babies. This lot, the 12th lot, fell to John Jenny, and his company joined to him. And when you go to the 12th name of the 13 names, there is Stephen Deane.
So that explains why these 2 people would have been in association with each other.
Possibly you are a single man living in my home.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. So what are the things that you would suggest I think about between now and, I only really have, most of your staff have weeks, months.
Right.
Maybe they go to school for this. They learn a lot about the era.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are amateur actors or professional actors before they even come here. It sounds like a lot of them go through a multi-week training program here before they're even allowed on site. So I'm a complete neophyte showing up. I have about 6 days to get my act together. In addition to practicing the stuff I'll be listening to on the tape, what are some other things you would want me to be thinking about or focusing on? Do I want to develop actual personality for my character in terms of how is he quiet? Is he boisterous? Is he like? Do the characters get into that level of?
And we can work on that when we're together. First of all, Ethan's been reading a lot of material in a very short amount of time, and one of the things that I gave him is Nathaniel Philbrick's Mayflower Papers, which is a selection of Plymouth colony writings abridged so that you can very quickly get a sense of everything from the beginning of the church in 1609 till the end when Bradford brought the manuscript to a conclusion in 1647. I would say read from 1621 to 1627 in this, so you have those stories that you're an eyewitness to. For anyone saying, how do I put this story on in a broader context or narrative, I strongly suggest looking at a book that's available in our shops. It's available online. Eugene Aubrey Stratton was a genealogist and wonderful historian, and what he does in this book is he gives the history of the colony from 1620 until its dissolution in 1692 when it becomes part of Massachusetts. He then does chapter by chapter subjects like master and servant, the written record, and then there are 350 individual bios of people in Plymouth Colony at the end of the book. So if after being with us for this last hour you say, but I don't know the story and the pattern of the broader story, pick up a copy of Stratton. I gave Ethan the first chapter to this book because it covers everything from about 1608 to 1627. For our purposes on Saturday, Ethan doesn't need to know anything after what happens on June 21st, 1627, but that chapter gives you the broader context of Stephen Deane's life.
And the question that just came in had to do with giving me background on the opinions and social sentiments of the time. How would I get my brain around the way one of these people would have thought about what relations between men and women, about their standing in society, about...
And I can give you Jim Baker, who has retired from Plimoth Plantation and was formerly our director of research, did a lot of research with Keith Thomas, the author of Religion and the Decline of Magic. And so Jim created a series of chapters on worldview that's outside of the traditional doctrinal approach to the invisible world, that will give you a sense of how you perceive the nighttime, how you perceive social hierarchy, how you would deport yourself with others, how you perceive the passage of time. For someone living in Plymouth Colony in 1627, if they had lived in a big town or an urban center, and in the 17th century there are only 5 urban centers in England, they would have been accustomed to hearing time passing with bells everywhere. There is nothing here. So if you are accustomed to an oral passage of time, there is nothing here but silence.
Which must have been terrifying to some people, I can imagine. Or the adjustment from living in a city or even a small town to essentially not only just the sense of, as you said, the noises you hear around you, the church bells and so forth, but just the utter aloneness they must have felt, the kind of existential. I mean, maybe for some that was exciting, but for others I can imagine it would have been terrifying. Like what kind of wild beast is going to come out of the woods, or for that matter, the natives with whom the colony had rocky relations with over the years, it sounds like, from what I understand.
And we tend to forget the number of people that chose to go back, that found this far too difficult and utterly economically and emotionally dislocating. And so even though they had experimented with all of their goods to get here, they go back to England. That the challenge is just too great.
What I find interesting, just looking at the level of the costuming here, which is period appropriate. That it looks quite fancy. It seems like it would be appropriate if you're walking down the street in London, but to be in this colonial setting where it's rough work and you're doing manual labor, it's a fairly fine fabric and like well designed thing that seems like, maybe for strolling about with your cane, but not necessarily for hoeing the garden,
Denise chose to represent you as someone at a wedding.
Yes.
And you would also have work clothes.
I see, okay.
And one of the things Denise has been exploring is the distinction between presentational clothes for church, for court sessions, for weddings, and the way you use your clothes in daily life, and how you protect your clothes with different types of outerwear, and how you change your clothes in different circumstances. So if you come on Saturday to see Ethan transform himself into Stephen Deane, go on our website, plimoth.org, look at June 21st, and you'll get details of the wedding day, of the times of different events that are going on. And in the middle of the day, you'll see something called Parley with a Pilgrim, and that will be your opportunity a few days from now to find out what Ethan has learned since the conversation today on Monday, what his morning experience of being in the village is like, and what we're going to work on in the afternoon. Because maybe we should give ourselves some objectives for the last part of the day and what we hope to accomplish then. But do come for the wedding. Which
is in the afternoon, right?
Which will be in the afternoon.
Is it 1:32-ish? Is that when it is?
I think so.
Yeah.
And there'll be period dining, feasting, dancing. It really is one of the loveliest of events. And come and see the new cookhouse going up, because Jane Cook's father, Francis, is building a house in the village, and you can see that under construction. It's one of the finest examples of the vernacular architectural work that our colonial artisans do in recreating the past.
With the mud and the weaving and the wattle daub, it's really quite lovely.
Yes, and that house is scheduled to open to the public sometime in August. So come and see it under construction, become a member of Plimoth Plantation, and you can have as many free visits as you want over the course of that year, and you can watch the house as it becomes part of our daily programming and specialized programming. So thank you, Ethan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening, and thank you so much for your questions, and look forward to maybe meeting some of you on Saturday. Be gentle to me, and thanks again for the opportunity. And we'll see you again in a different role, in a different costume, in a different life.
How can they follow you online?
So yes, briefly myself. So in addition to what I'm doing for the Story for the Globe, I have a website. Which is EthanGilsdorf.com, and I also am on Twitter at EthanFreak, F-R-E-A-K, and I don't know if I'll be necessarily tweeting my experience, because that would be not appropriate to be having my device with me while I'm in costume.
That came on the next ship.
Yeah, right. But absolutely, and I would obviously be happy to entertain questions. If anyone wants to drop me an email or something, my address is ethan@ethangilsdorf.com. But hope to see some of you this weekend. And again, thanks, Richard.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here, Ethan. Goodbye, everyone.
Take
Thank
care.
you.